I never imagined a simple car ride could turn my world upside down. But when my boss's wife, Sarah, sat in the passenger seat that evening, her trembling voice and broken gaze revealed a secret I never saw coming. She wasn't just lonely. She was desperate for someone to see her, to save her. And somehow, she chose me. What happened next changed everything. Jason's life was simple, or so he thought. At 32, he worked tirelessly at a prestigious firm under Mark, a man both admired and feared by his peers. Mark wasn't the kind of boss you wanted to grab a beer with. His cold demeanor and obsession with power made him unapproachable. But Jason knew how to navigate the job, keeping his head down and avoiding unnecessary attention. Mark's wife, Sarah, was the opposite of her husband. She radiated warmth, a kind of elegance that drew people in effortlessly. Jason had only seen her at corporate gatherings, always at Mark's side, a trophy of perfection. Yet, even in those brief moments, Jason noticed a shadow behind her bright smile, a hint of sadness she couldn't quite hide. Jason's routine rarely crossed paths with Sarah. He worked late hours, often escaping into his solitary apartment, where silence was his only companion. He wasn't unhappy, but he wasn't fulfilled either. That Tuesday night was no exception. After wrapping up his tasks, Jason was looking forward to unwinding when his phone buzzed unexpectedly. "Hi, Jason." Sarah's soft voice came through, tentative but polite. "I hope I'm not bothering you. I need a favor." Her words caught him off guard. She never reached out, let alone for something personal. When she explained that she needed a ride to a meeting, Jason hesitated. It wasn't in his job description to chauffeur his boss's wife, but her tone carried a vulnerability that was hard to ignore. He agreed, trying to convince himself it was just a favor. But as he pulled up to her grand house, a sinking feeling settled in his chest. Sarah stood at the door, a vision of grace and melancholy. Her casual attire didn't mask her beauty, but her eyes, those betrayed a deeper story. In the car, the atmosphere grew heavier. Sarah's polite small talk soon gave way to confessions Jason wasn't prepared for. She spoke of a marriage that felt more like a cage, of years spent yearning for love and connection. Jason, stunned by her honesty, realized the woman beside him wasn't the picture-perfect wife he had imagined. She was human, aching, vulnerable, and searching for solace. As the days passed, Jason couldn't shake the memory of that evening with Sarah. Her words lingered like a faint echo in the back of his mind, stirring a mixture of confusion and unease. He told himself it wasn't his place to think about her personal struggles, but her sadness had carved a space in his thoughts he couldn't ignore. At work, Mark's presence loomed as always, dominating the office with his relentless drive and sharp tongue. Jason found himself studying Mark in a way he never had before. The man was successful, undeniably, but he seemed detached, almost mechanical in his interactions. It made Sarah's confessions feel even heavier. How could someone like her, elegant, kind, and full of life, be tethered to a man so cold? Then, little things started to stand out. Sarah began texting Jason sporadically, under the guise of needing small favors. A ride here, help with errands there. Each time she seemed to open up just a little more, her tone softer, her words heavier. Jason noticed himself waiting for her messages, his heart quickening at the sight of her name lighting up his screen. But with every new interaction, a creeping sense of guilt began to take hold. This wasn't normal, was it? She was his boss's wife. Jason tried to convince himself that he was only helping her out of kindness, but deep down, he felt the boundaries shifting. And it wasn't just Sarah. He could feel it in himself, too. The turning point came one evening when Sarah called him late. Her voice was quiet, shaky. "Jason, I didn't know who else to call. I needed someone to talk to." Her vulnerability was disarming, and Jason found himself agreeing to meet her at a quiet cafe. When he arrived, she was already there, sitting at a corner table. The weight of her gaze as he sat down told him this wasn't just a casual conversation. "I feel like I'm disappearing," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Mark doesn't see me anymore, I'm just there." Jason listened, torn between empathy and unease. He tried to offer comfort without crossing any lines, but the way Sarah looked at him, like he was her lifeline, sent a jolt through him. The tension between them was undeniable now, an invisible thread pulling them closer. At work, Jason began to notice Sarah's name slipping into his thoughts during quiet moments. He caught himself wondering if Mark knew, if he had any inkling of his wife's loneliness. Jason had seen the way Mark brushed her off at events, how he never stayed at her side for long. Was it possible Mark knew but didn't care? The guilt gnawed at Jason, but so did the curiosity. What was it about Sarah that had him so captivated? It wasn't just her beauty or her elegance. It was the raw honesty she shared with him, the way she exposed the cracks in her seemingly perfect life. One day, while working late, Jason received another text from Sarah. "I can't keep doing this," it read. He stared at the screen, his mind racing. What did she mean? Did she mean her marriage? Or something more? The tension in Jason's chest grew unbearable. He felt like he was standing on the edge of something he couldn't name, something that could change everything. He wanted to help her, to be there for her. But at what cost? That night, as he lay awake in bed, Jason realized the truth he had been avoiding. He wasn't just helping Sarah out of kindness anymore. He cared about her, deeply. And as wrong as it felt, he couldn't stop himself from wanting to be the person who saw her, who understood her. Jason found himself in uncharted territory. Every interaction with Sarah seemed to blur the lines he had tried so hard to maintain. It wasn't just the stolen glances or the way her voice softened when she spoke to him. It was the way he felt when she was around. A pull he couldn't resist no matter how hard he tried. It was a quiet Friday evening when she texted him again. "Can you stop by? I need to talk." He knew it wasn't wise. Each visit, each conversation, felt like stepping deeper into waters he couldn't navigate. But he didn't hesitate. By the time he pulled up to her house, the sky was painted in hues of orange and pink, the sun sinking into the horizon. Sarah opened the door before he could even knock. She looked different, not the polished, elegant woman he usually saw, but vulnerable, almost fragile. Her eyes held a sadness that made his chest tighten. "Come in," she said softly, stepping aside to let him enter. Jason followed her into the living room, his heart pounding. The room was dimly lit, casting long shadows that danced on the walls. She motioned for him to sit on the couch while she settled into the armchair opposite him. "I don't know how to start this," she began, her voice trembling. "I've been thinking a lot about everything." Jason nodded, unsure of what to say. The air between them was thick with unspoken words, with emotions neither of them dared to name. "You can tell me," he said finally, his voice low. She met his gaze, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I feel like I've been living someone else's life, like I'm stuck in a role I didn't choose, and I don't know how to break free." Her words hit him like a wave, the rawness of her pain making it impossible to look away. "You deserve more than that, Sarah," he said, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. "You deserve to be happy." She smiled faintly, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Happiness feels like a distant memory," she whispered. "I thought I could find it again with Mark, but he doesn't see me. Not the real me." Jason leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "I see you," he said, the words slipping out before he could stop them. Sarah froze, her breath hitching. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then she looked away, her cheeks flushing. Jason, you can't say things like that. Why not? He countered, his voice firmer now. It's the truth. You deserve someone who sees you for who you are, who cares about you. And if Mark can't be that person... He trailed off, unsure how to finish the sentence without crossing a line he wasn't sure he could come back from. Sarah stood abruptly, pacing the room. This isn't fair, she said, her voice cracking. To you, to me, to anyone. I don't know what I'm doing anymore. Jason rose, taking a hesitant step toward her. Sarah, you don't have to go through this alone. I'm here. She turned to face him, her expression a mix of anger, frustration, and something else. Something softer. Why do you care so much? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Because I can't stand seeing you like this, he admitted. Because you matter to me. The silence that followed was deafening. They stood there, mere feet apart, the weight of his words hanging between them. Slowly, Sarah closed the distance, her gaze locked on his. This is wrong, she said, but she didn't step back. I know, Jason replied, his voice soft, but it doesn't change how I feel. Her hand trembled as she reached out, brushing his fingers lightly. The touch was electric, sending a shiver down his spine. He should have pulled away, should have walked out the door and never looked back. But he didn't. Instead, he closed the gap, his hand gently covering hers. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. The world outside faded away, leaving only the two of them, standing on the edge of a precipice. Jason could see the conflict in her eyes, the battle between what she wanted and what she knew was right. Jason, she began, but he silenced her with a shake of his head. You don't have to say anything, he said. Just let this moment be what it is. Tears welled in her eyes, and she leaned into him, her forehead resting against his. Jason's heart raced as he wrapped his arms around her, holding her as if she might disappear. It was a fragile moment, one filled with unspoken promises and forbidden desires. As the evening stretched into night, they stayed like that, wrapped in each other's warmth, knowing that whatever came next, there was no going back. The line had been crossed, and their lives would never be the same. The days following that night were a blur of emotions for Jason. Every glance at his phone, every step into the office, felt charged with an invisible weight. Sarah hadn't reached out since their last meeting, and he couldn't decide if that was a relief or a punishment. He was caught in a whirlwind of guilt and longing, unable to focus on anything but the memory of her touch and the pain in her eyes. But the bubble of secrecy was fragile, and Jason's world shattered when Mark called him into his office one morning. Mark's office was an intimidating space, filled with dark leather furniture and walls lined with plaques and awards. Jason stood awkwardly near the desk as Mark leaned back in his chair, his sharp eyes studying him. Jason, Mark began, his tone unreadable. I need to ask you something, and I expect honesty. Jason's stomach churned. He had no idea what was coming, but the tension in Mark's voice sent alarm bells ringing in his mind. Of course, sir, he replied, forcing himself to meet Mark's gaze. Mark leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. Sarah's been different lately, he said, his words slow and deliberate. She's distracted, distant. I know you've spent some time with her recently. She mentioned you helped her with a few things. Has she said anything to you? Jason's mind raced, his pulse pounding in his ears. Did Mark know? Was this a trap? He chose his words carefully, keeping his tone neutral. She hasn't said much, sir. Just some small things about feeling a little overwhelmed. Mark's expression darkened, and Jason felt the air in the room grow heavier. Overwhelmed? Mark repeated, his voice dripping with skepticism. She has no reason to be overwhelmed. Everything she could possibly want, I've given her. Jason's hands clenched at his sides. He wanted to argue, to tell Mark that material things couldn't replace emotional connection. But he knew better than to provoke his boss. "I'm sure it's nothing serious," he said, trying to sound convincing. "She probably just needs some time." Mark narrowed his eyes, studying Jason as if searching for cracks in his facade. After a long, tense pause, he leaned back in his chair and dismissed Jason with a curt nod. "That will be all." Jason left the office feeling like he had just narrowly avoided disaster. But the encounter only deepened his unease. Mark's words echoed in his mind. Everything she could possibly want, I've given her. The arrogance, the lack of understanding. It was no wonder Sarah felt invisible. Later that evening, Jason's phone buzzed with a message from Sarah. "Can we talk? It's important." Jason didn't hesitate. Within minutes, he was in his car, driving to her house. The moment she opened the door, he could see the fear in her eyes. "Mark knows something's wrong," she said, her voice trembling. "He's been watching me, questioning me." Jason stepped inside, closing the door behind him. "Did you tell him anything?" he asked, his voice low. She shook her head, tears welling up. "No, but he's suspicious. I can feel it. Jason, I'm scared." Jason reached out, his hands gently resting on her shoulders. "It's going to be okay," he said, though he wasn't sure he believed it. "We'll figure this out." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of a car pulling into the driveway. Sarah's eyes widened in panic. "It's Mark," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Jason's heart raced as he looked around, his mind scrambling for a solution. "Where can I go?" he asked urgently. Sarah pointed toward the back door. "The kitchen," she said. "There's a side door that leads to the garden." Jason moved quickly, slipping out the back just as the front door opened. He crouched behind a hedge, his breath coming in short, shallow bursts. From his hiding spot, he could hear Mark's voice inside the house. "Where were you?" Mark asked, his tone sharp. "I went for a walk," Sarah replied, her voice steady despite the tension in the air. There was a pause, and Jason could imagine Mark studying her, searching for signs of deception. "You've been acting strange lately," Mark said finally. "Is there something you're not telling me?" Jason held his breath, his body tense as he waited for Sarah's response. "I'm just tired, Mark," she said, her tone weary. "You've been so busy with work, and I've been feeling a little disconnected." Mark's response was curt. "Well, you need to get over it. I don't have time for this nonsense." Jason felt a surge of anger at Mark's callousness, but he stayed hidden, waiting for the sound of Mark's footsteps retreating. When he finally heard the door close, he exhaled a shaky breath and slipped away into the night. The confrontation had shaken him, but it also solidified something in his mind. Mark didn't deserve Sarah. She deserved someone who cared, who saw her, who valued her as more than just a possession. And Jason couldn't ignore the fact that he wanted to be that person. But the risks were growing. Mark's suspicions, the secrecy, the constant tension. It was all building towards something inevitable. Jason knew that if they were discovered, the fallout would be catastrophic. But even as the danger loomed, he couldn't bring himself to stay away from Sarah. Their connection had crossed a line, and there was no going back. The fallout began the moment Mark found out. Jason wasn't sure how it happened, whether it was a slip on Sarah's part, a misstep on his, or simply Mark's relentless suspicion. But one evening, as Jason sat in his small apartment, his phone buzzed with a message that turned his blood cold. "We need to talk. Now." It was from Mark. Jason arrived at Mark's house, his heart pounding so hard it felt like it would leap out of his chest. He tried to calm himself, to convince himself that Mark didn't know. But as he stepped into the dimly lit living room and saw the look on Mark's face, he knew the truth was out. Mark stood with his arms crossed, his face a mask of cold fury. Sarah was seated on the couch, her eyes red and puffy, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She couldn't look at Jason, and that hurt more than anything else. "I'm going to ask this once," Mark said, his voice dangerously quiet. "What the hell is going on between you two?" Jason's mouth went dry. He glanced at Sarah, but she didn't move, didn't speak. It was up to him. "Mark," he began, his voice shaking slightly. "It's not what you think." "Don't lie to me!" Mark bellowed, slamming his fist on the coffee table. The sudden outburst made Jason flinch. "I'm not an idiot, Jason. I've seen the way you look at her. I've seen the texts." Jason's stomach sank. The texts. He hadn't deleted them, hadn't thought to hide them. Mark must have found them on Sarah's phone. "I'm sorry," Jason said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. Mark let out a bitter laugh. "Sorry? That's all you've got to say? You betrayed me, Jason. You betrayed this family." "I didn't mean for any of this to happen," Jason said, his voice cracking. "But it did, and I can't change that." Mark turned to Sarah, his expression a mix of anger and pain. "And you," he said, his voice filled with venom. "How long has this been going on?" Sarah finally looked up, her eyes glistening with tears. "It wasn't like that," she said softly. "I was lonely, Mark. You were never there." Mark's face twisted with rage. "Don't you dare put this on me," he spat. "I gave you everything, and this is how you repay me?" Jason couldn't take it anymore. "You didn't give her everything," he said, his voice rising. "You gave her things, Mark, but you didn't give her what she needed. You didn't see her, didn't care about her." The room fell silent, Mark's eyes burning into Jason. "Get out," he said finally, his voice cold and final. "Both of you." Jason hesitated, glancing at Sarah, but she didn't move. She was frozen, her face pale, her hands trembling. Jason wanted to reach out to her, to take her hand and walk out with her, but she stayed rooted to the couch, her gaze fixed on the floor. "Go," Mark said again, louder this time. Jason nodded and turned to leave, the weight of everything crashing down on him as he stepped out into the cool night air. The days that followed were unbearable. Jason tried to call Sarah, but she didn't answer. He drove by her house once, but it was dark, and he couldn't bring himself to knock on the door. The uncertainty, the silence, it was torture. At work, the tension was palpable. Mark didn't fire Jason, but he made it clear that their relationship would never be the same. Meetings were icy, conversations curt. Jason felt like an outsider, a pariah. The once friendly camaraderie with his coworkers had turned into whispered gossip and sideways glances. And then, one day, Sarah showed up at his apartment. She looked exhausted, her face drawn, her eyes heavy with sorrow. "I'm leaving," she said simply, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. Jason stared at her, his heart racing. "Leaving? What do you mean?" "Mark and I are done," she said, her voice flat. "I've filed for divorce." Jason's mind spun. "What about us?" he asked, his voice tinged with desperation. Sarah hesitated, her gaze falling to the floor. "I don't know," she admitted. "I can't think about that right now. I need to figure out who I am, what I want." Her words were like a dagger to Jason's chest, but he couldn't blame her. She had been through so much, and he had been a part of the chaos. "I understand," he said softly. "If you need time, I'll wait." Sarah smiled faintly, a ghost of the warmth he had once seen in her. "Thank you, Jason, for everything." And with that, she was gone. Jason stood in the doorway, watching her walk away, a mix of sadness and hope swirling in his chest. He didn't know what the future held, but one thing was certain: nothing would ever be the same. Months passed, and life settled into a strange new normal for Jason. The intensity of those chaotic days with Sarah and Mark had faded, replaced by a quieter, more reflective existence. Jason remained at the company, though his interactions with Mark were strictly professional and devoid of the camaraderie they once shared. Sarah's departure had left a void in both their lives. Jason often thought of her, wondering where she was and how she was doing. He resisted the urge to reach out, respecting her need for space and time to heal. But the memories lingered: the warmth of her smile, the sadness in her eyes, and the fragile connection they had shared. One evening, Jason found himself sitting in the same cafe where he and Sarah had once talked. The rain pattered softly against the windows, and he stared into his coffee, lost in thought. He couldn't deny that the experience had changed him, forcing him to confront parts of himself he had long ignored. For the first time, Jason acknowledged his own loneliness. He had spent so much of his life on autopilot, going through the motions without truly connecting to anyone. Sarah had been a mirror, reflecting his own unmet desires and emotional isolation. In helping her, he had seen himself more clearly than ever before. But their story also served as a harsh reminder of the consequences of blurred boundaries and unspoken feelings. Jason had crossed a line he shouldn't have, and though he didn't regret caring for Sarah, he wished he had handled things differently. The fallout had been painful, not just for him, but for everyone involved. One afternoon, while organizing files at work, Jason stumbled upon an old photo from a company event. It was a picture of Mark and Sarah, smiling for the camera. Sarah's smile was radiant, but now Jason could see the faint shadow in her eyes, the same shadow that had grown over time and led her to him. He realized then that love and connection couldn't thrive without effort, without vulnerability and attention. Mark had neglected Sarah, taking her presence for granted, and Jason had been drawn to fill that void. But in the process, they had all been hurt, their lives tangled in a web of mistakes and misunderstandings. Jason began to focus on rebuilding himself. He started attending therapy, seeking to understand his emotions and patterns. Slowly, he learned to set boundaries, to communicate better, and to seek relationships built on mutual respect and honesty. The lessons he had learned from his time with Sarah stayed with him, shaping him into someone more self-aware and compassionate. As for Sarah, he heard through the grapevine that she had moved to another city and started fresh. She had taken up painting, something she had always wanted to do, but never had the time for. Jason smiled when he heard this. She deserved happiness, and he hoped she had finally found it. One evening, as he walked home from work, Jason paused to watch the sunset. The sky was a vibrant mix of orange and purple, and for the first time in a long time, he felt at peace. The past had left its scars, but it had also taught him invaluable lessons about love, loss, and the importance of truly seeing the people around him. Jason took a deep breath and whispered to himself, "Sometimes, the hardest lessons lead to the greatest growth." With that, he walked into the future, ready to build a life rooted in truth, connection, and a deeper understanding of himself and others. What would you have done in Jason's place? Could you walk away from such a powerful connection? Or would you take the risk? Let us know in the comments below. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more gripping stories like this one. Stay tuned, because our next story will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about love and loyalty.